My name is Martijn Lofvers. I'm Chief Trendwatcher of Supply Chain Media. I'm also the Chief Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Movement. This is our European quarterly magazine and also bi-weekly newsletter, and a huge LinkedIn group. I think already 60,000 members on LinkedIn. So I will be having a live webinar today, and I'm happy to say, we have over 200 registrants of this webinar, and we're not going to talk about AI per se. No, we're going to talk about a different topic, but maybe it's a bit more important even, cost to serve. So I'm happy to see that, a lot of people are joining and in this live webinar. So that's good to know, and I'm very happy to have you here. And with me, I have, next to myself, I have Bram DeSmet. He's CEO of Solventure, and he's also adjunct professor at the Vlerick Ghent Management School. That's a business school. And he's author of 3 books. You see the titles of the 3 books next to his picture. So welcome, Bram.
Welcome, or hello, Martijn. Thank you for having me here today.
Yeah. So, when I do some time series, when you look at the dates of the books, the next book will be expected, in my opinion, on 2027. So can we expect your next book next year?
Yeah. I was trained as a mathematician, so it's very compulsive to me, but though I need to admit that potentially it's going to be a challenge, because if it needs to be there next year, then I need to start writing more or less as we speak. And I'd love to write a new book, but time could be a challenge.
But AI can help you, sorry to say.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But
and if you look at these 3 topics on your book,
yeah.
Do you see an evolution on that level before we go into deep on the topic of cost to serve?
Yeah, so if you look at the books, I think I started by figuring out how strategy, supply chain, and finance interact more on a strategic level. And gradually, I'm getting more to the planning level. So in the latest book, there is already 2 chapters on connected planning. So if there would be a new book, I would zoom in even more on planning and say, okay, how should we better connect the different plans in the organization? As an example, better connect the supply chain plan and the financial plan. And I would take a more active stance towards the current APS softwares and the current FP&A softwares, where also, according to me, are some of the gaps to better support the executive decision making in the companies. So that's if there is a new book, that's probably where what would be the core theme of the new book.
But you still remain to focus on the business strategy, the different kind of business strategy as a starting point, all these kind of things. So you have customer intimacy, product leadership, and operational excellence. That's still all right. Okay, some housekeeping notes. So this webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded at this moment. It will be on YouTube within 48 hours. So the presentation will be downloadable as PDF. The audience is on mute, but you can chat. Okay, you can chat amongst each other. Will this be recorded? Yes, it will. But if you want to have questions with Bram or me, please use the Q&A functionality on the right-hand side. You see the small text bubbles. I will check these questions, and if these questions are in line of the conference I will be having with Bram, I will ask these questions immediately. If not, we have a Q&A at the end, and you can, we will ask this question over there. If you still have some interest to have a conversation with Bram and me, please join us after the whole hour, and then you can join us in our virtual lounge in Airmeet. And it looks like this. All right, at this moment, we will be putting off our camera so you can enlarge your screen and you have a better look at the presentation. All right, so Bram, we're living in turbulent times. Times are changing, etc. This is an overview of, the phrases CEO are talking about during their quarterly earning calls with financial analysts. So this is, a capture of what CEOs and CFOs are talking about with their analysts. These are Fortune 500 companies. And to look at the screen, looks quite small, but to the right, you see the most mentioned phrases. So on the right-hand side, you see AI. Yes, CEOs are talking about AI. We'll talk about it later. And also on tariffs, on supply chain. Supply chain has been on this graph since the start of COVID. And in yellow, you see more IT-related phrases, and in blue, you see more supply chain related phrases like reshoring, local for local, and also digital twin. And in red, you see well, the risk related phrases. US government shutdown is typical US. But if you look at this graph, Bram, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I think the terms which attract my attention is like the combination of supply chain and reshoring, where where I'm a bit puzzled is that I see a lot of companies that keep on struggling with a lack of resilience in the supply chain. It's like, yeah, we already know since COVID that reducing our exposure and going more towards reshoring and local for local production and sourcing strategy is the way to go. At the same time, when we look at the cost impact and the required capex and investment, we remain very reluctant. So yeah, so I'm really puzzled by like how companies drag on a bit with, I would say, supply chains that are not flexible enough or not resilient enough, and then we keep facing surprises when import tariffs are being called off, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, right. And if we go to the next slide, this is my own slide. So I started to create this slide at the start of COVID. You know, the first black swan was COVID, and you see lockdowns, shortages, bullwhips, etc. And then you see, you can see it by yourself. The other black swans: war in Ukraine, Gaza, Trump being elected, and Trump vomiting all kind of tariffs into the world and other things. Nexperia is also on there. And bullwhips, we are all familiar in supply chain. The latest addition to this graph I did last month was middle top. You know, you see the conversion from dollars to euros. So the conversion ratio is another unexpected thing. So that's and that's increasing costs, especially when you're internationally trading, selling in dollars and paying your employees in euros has a huge effect. And if you look at this, what is your take on this graph, in your opinion?
Well, so in general, my feeling remains that we stay in a very reactive mode. My feeling is that supply chain people are sometimes also too flexible. Like whatever happens, we find a way to react to it and still maintain reasonable service levels at reasonable cost levels. And maybe linking to the topic of the webinar today, my question is, if we would better understand what the reactive behavior really costs, would we be in a position that we can come up with investments and more deliberate increases of costs, for instance, through reshoring or local sourcing and so on, to make us more proactive and at the same time more resilient, and probably the lack of understanding what all of this firefighting is really costing. That's probably also inhibiting us to become a bit more proactive and truly more resilient.
Yes, I totally agree. I think this geopolitical turmoil is on the high agenda of the board, and despite all this turmoil, supply chains remain active. Companies don't collapse. Maybe Nexperia has some impact, but in general, GDP of countries don't collapse. Industries don't collapse totally. So we keep doing our business. So that's one thing. But you're right. The costs, you see it on a top side, is impacted more heavily, and we talk about it in this webinar. And we have some answers to your suggestions coming up, because when we did a survey 1 year ago, cost reduction is still one of the main topics. So everybody talk about resilience, but in the end, supply chain executives have always on number one and number two, cost reduction as a target for their supply chain. All right, maybe you can explain, to start with all this. So maybe you can explain, as a professor, what is the cost of selling products?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, if I look at cost to serve, I see a couple of challenges in companies, and If we zoom in a bit on how costing is done, on the right-hand side of the slide here, if you look at product cost, I would say the easy stuff is the direct material and the direct labor. We know how many raw materials go into our product. We know how many hours an operator might need to spend to produce a certain volume, so that's relatively easy. It already becomes a bit trickier with what we call manufacturing overheads. And an example could be changeover costs. How finance would typically allocate is based on very rough metrics like volumes. What is the volume we produced? If we produced 6,000 and the total is 10,000, then 60% of that manufacturing overhead will be allocated to that first product. If you look at changeovers, what you would then see is that fast movers in proportion probably get too much of the costs allocated, and slow movers in proportion get too little of the costs associated. And that's skewing the costing, and in that sense, it's also skewing the margins.
Mm-hmm.
Next to the product costs, there's in the product cost, you typically have the manufacturing related overheads, but there's also all other overheads, what we in general would call SG&A, sales, general and administrative. Logistics costs quite often are in that SG&A, in the non-manufacturing related overhead costs. And here again, later on, we will see an example. If you deliver to retailers, well, maybe for one retailer, you deliver in full pallets to a central distribution center. And for a second retailer, you might be doing store level picking and doing the transport in a milk round, really to deliver into the different stores. Obviously the transport cost is going to completely different again. So these overheads are typically not in the product cost. So if you want to do pricing, the product cost in itself might not be enough, because the key differentiator might be in the non-manufacturing overhead. And two, if finance would need to allocate, again, finance would typically allocate based on volumes sold or volumes produced, without taking into account what the real cost drivers are. So what the real cost is and what on the real profitability is, for instance, on a customer level. And the same is then repeated on the left. So manufacturing overhead in general is allocated based on very rough rules, and might not give a good visibility of the true manufacturing costs. Downstream costs are typically not included in the manufacturing overhead, so not in the product cost. So if you want to decide on pricing, product cost might not be enough. And anything that finance delivers you might not be enough to come to good cost understanding, good pricing mechanisms, and good profitability understanding.
So if I look at this, two things come up into my mind. One, finance is not supply chain or value chain oriented. You mentioned you have product, and logistics is outside this calculation. So you don't have value stream calculation in finance. Mm-hmm. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's true. So the reporting that finance has, and that is the reporting that is in ERP systems, is focused on the P&L. And in the P&L, you have the cost of goods sold. That's what finance will look at, and then you have the SG&A. But it's so the finance reporting and what you would commonly find in ERPs is not supporting value chain costing and value chain pricing and value chain profitability analysis.
So that's one thing. Another thing, it's remarkable. You're talking about direct and indirect costs, but when you talk to financial controllers, they talk about a lot of the times fixed and variable costs.
Yeah, and so fixed versus variable, I get the point, but for me, I would almost say it's again a finance invention, because even the fixed costs in the long term are variable. And also near the end of the webinar, I will try to explain that we need to, when we look at profitability, we do need to take a look at the total picture, because I see a lot of focus in companies, for instance, on but what's the variable cost and what is the margin over the variable cost? But if you don't have enough volume to account for the fixed costs of a certain plant or a certain machine, then you still have an issue. So in the end, you need to look at the different cost elements, and when we zoom into that later, I see that again, finance sometimes gets mixed up in their own language and in their own lingo, rather than looking with a common sense perspective. Okay, what are we earning at the end of the game, on which customers and on which products?
All right, and I think this is very important. This kind of conversations supply chain people should have with their financial colleagues. Otherwise, you're lost. We'll get to that point later on. So maybe talk about cost allocation. Can you give you an example of how normally cost allocation would be done?
Yeah. So again, this is a very simple example, but if you look at those changeover costs, and let's assume that they are 10,000 euro. If we have two products, orange juice and berry juice, the typical rough allocation would be that we allocate those changeover costs based on volumes. And so in this case, 6,000 euro would go to the orange juice and 4,000 euro would go to the berry juice. A more correct way, if you go one further, is to say, well, instead of just looking at the volume, I could obviously look at what is the number of changeovers. That would potentially be already more correct. And though the berry juice volume is a bit lower, I may still have the same number of changeovers. So if I base myself on changeovers, you see that it becomes 50-50. Yeah. And it's based on a recent experience with a customer, where that customer told me, like, Bram, the blueberries, that's really a nightmare from a cleaning perspective. And so the color intensity of blueberries is that high that if we have to produce something after the blueberries, there's a lot more cleaning that we need to do. So if instead of number of changeovers, I would look at the number of cleaning hours, I would see that for blueberries, there's a lot more cleaning hours that I need. And so if I allocate the changeover costs based on the number of cleaning hours, you almost see that the costs are inverted. So instead of allocating 6,000 on the orange juice, I'm now allocating 6,000 to the berry juice. And this has a dramatic impact. I can give a real life example. So we were working with one of the customers. And again, if they were looking at product costing, the changeovers were allocated based on volume. And when we were allocating based on the number of changeovers, what you were seeing is that the changeover cost allocated to the fast movers went down, and there's a lot more changeovers for the slow movers. So the changeover cost for the slow movers went significantly up. And the person told me, he said, Bram, in the past, when we had displays for promotions in stores, we were adding a lot of the slow movers because we thought that the margin on the slow movers was relatively good. But that was obviously due to a wrong cost calculation. And he said, okay, now that we have a better understanding and we understand that the margins on the slow movers are not good at all, we are putting more of the fast movers into the displays. And it had a dramatic impact on their overall cost levels and their margin levels and their inventory levels. So if you base yourself on the wrong information, you will make the wrong decision. And if you get a better visibility on the true costs and the true margins, it can have a big impact on the type of decisions you make, and also on the business outcome that you have as a result.
Yeah. So I got a comment in the chat. If fine to have a chat, and if you want to relate it as a question, feel free to ask these questions in the bubbles on the right. One of the comments is, this is why cost prices should be based on time-driven, activity-based costing. I did some research in my university days, I think almost 30 years ago. Still, I was one of the first to do that, activity-based costing, time-driven. What is your take? Do a lot of companies do activity-based costing in a time-driven way, Bram?
Well, it's a dangerous one in the sense that where I've seen activity-based costing, I've seen companies who get lost in complexity. So when it's about refining cost, I think one of the challenges is there's always a Pareto, like, okay, how do we come up with a model that with 20% of the complexity gets to 80% of the cost allocations right, so to speak. And so, yeah, so time-driven activity-based costing, 100%. It's common sense, but from what I have seen, certainly I would say in engineering companies, we then have a tendency to overdo it. So when we do it, we need to do it with common sense and with the Pareto rule in mind.
Yeah. So this was an internal example now, and you mentioned already when you have an external customer side, how do you respond to the cost allocation in that side?
Yeah, so and this is so you could say like the changeover is typically in the manufacturing overhead, and that's impacting the product cost or the standard cost of the product. I already referred to that example on the distribution or the transportation or the warehousing side, which in general is then more in the SG&A, and it's another real life example where okay, if you want to get to a good pricing model, let's put it like that. Yeah, if the logistics model for two customers can be significantly different, it's important. Yeah, it's important that I understand the true cost to serve, including the warehousing and transport cost, to be able to come to a good pricing model. And also, if I want to compare the profitability across two customers, again, if there's a big difference in the way we logistically serve, then it's important that I can model that in sufficient detail to be able to make that comparison.
But when I look at this, it's about customer segmentation also in a financial way, because looking at Colruyt, the example on the left, delivery in full pallets, maybe that's an operational excellence environment, whereas in Carrefour, where you have picking up store level and milk rounds, etc., that's more customer or intimacy oriented.
Yeah.
And operational excellence versus customer intimacy, that goes with the price. So on the supermarket B should be have a higher price. So maybe as a company, as a manufacturer, you're servicing two different kind of business strategies. And are you aware of that? Do you want that? And I think that's mostly not a strategic conversation you will be having with your commercial sides.
Yeah, that's very true. So in general, and that may sound unrespectful, it's not meant like that, but salespeople are not very strategic. They are very opportunistic. And especially when a business is under pressure, you will see that on the service side, they can be very creative, and they start inventing all kinds of stuff, and they start promising all kinds of things to customers without having an understanding on what is the impact on the cost. And if they don't understand what is the impact on the cost, they can never come to a really good pricing. So sometimes we are so sales and volume driven that we are improvising on the service side of our supply chain triangle without knowing what is the impact on the cost or on the inventory. And then 2 years down the road, we start questioning, but is what we are doing, does that really make sense? Again, not even from a strategic perspective. Are we really earning money on this business? That is quite often a question that only comes after the fact.
So I know a friend of mine from university days. He used to be the VP supply chain of chemicals, a special chemicals manufacturing company, and he got all kind of requests from sales for very specialized small series of products. Basically, what he did, he added internal what he called bogus costs to say, okay, but that will cost you this. And he was, he was backed by the CFO who understand what he was doing. So basically, he added internal cost to say to sales, if you want this will be the costs. And then basically he was, driving the salespeople to the right segmentation. So not every other service, he's adding extra service cost into the price, and that's sales had to come to him. What would be the price for this? So that was a kind of gimmick or a way to lineate to get the service for free by sales.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have to have this kind of ways of doing a supply chain, but you have to be aware of that. And he was very successful in his job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you look at even going down, what is the traditional way of doing all this costing, and what should you do? Let's go in that way.
Yeah, well, I think on a high level. So what's the alternative for just allocating in a rough way, for instance, based on volume? And this is a different example. So now we are in procurement. Procurement could also be in that SG&A cost, so not be included in the product cost or the manufacturing overhead. And what I see in a lot of companies, like we may have stuff that is more commodity and somewhat bigger volume, and then we may have stuff in procurement that is more niche or more specialized. Yeah, and again, so if our procurement cost here would be 300,000, 300K, and theoretically, or how say that, as a matter of speaking, we here have standard bolts and specialty bolts. If I don't do anything special, the standard allocation would be okay. There's 9,000 of the standard bolts, there's 1,000 of the specialty bolts, and so 90% of the procurement cost will then go towards the standard bolts, and 30K or 10% will go towards the specialty bolts. And that would be the rough allocation. If we try to keep that in mind, 90%, 10%. Yeah, but if you would apply activity-based costing in a simple way, which is on the next slide. What we would typically do is potentially we go in two steps, or we try to go in one straight step. But if we look at the procurement cost, we could say there's salaries, there's travels, there's admin. What are typical activities that we have to do? So it's mapping our costs towards activities. And that could, for instance, be based on the number of FTEs. If I look at those salaries that we are using for the different activities in procurement. And if we say, okay, then looking at the staff costs and purchasing, how do we allocate that to the standard bolts and the specialty bolts? Well, instead of allocating it based on the volumes, what are possible activity drivers? And we could say, okay, well, maybe the number of POs is a better activity driver. And most probably I have a lot more POs for my specialty bolts compared to my standard bolts. And through allocating the cost of the staff based on an activity driver like the number of purchase orders, you can already see that I come to a different allocation of those costs towards the standard bolts and the specialty bolts.
Before we go to the next slide with the overall view, I think this is reflecting, what's been being wrong with the automotive supply chain, considering Nexperia. Nexperia is producing chips, thousands of them, 100,000 of them, and they're quite cheap chips that goes a lot of them into automotive. So that's actually a standard bolt, I would say. But then again, there's a lot of stock outs because of the turbulence between the Dutch government and the Chinese government and the headquarters in the Netherlands of Nexperia. You all have seen it. China. Now, in the end game is the European automotive doesn't get enough Nexperia cheap chips for automotive. There goes several into dashboards, etc. So these are like standard bolts. But if you use this kind of financial allocation, these Nexperia chips seems to be a lot of expensive, and as a consequence, you don't have enough inventory of those standard chips, and that's what is overcoming now in automotive.
Yeah, and what that triggers with me, like, it's not because something is cheap that it's not strategically important. So so we still need to get to a correct cost allocation.
Yes.
So if something is cheap, it's important that it shows up as cheap.
Yeah.
But then from a risk management perspective, if I don't have certain standard components or certain commodity raw materials available. And if my whole production flow comes to a halt, then from a risk perspective, I really need to think through how I try to mitigate those risks. And is it an inventory, or is it better agreements? And if I need better agreements, then maybe I need to spend more time, and my cost is again going up. So those two angles will always remain important.
Yeah, but it's good to mention it, because otherwise you shy away from this kind of discussions. Yeah. And the final part, you explain it. What kind of consequences does it have?
Yeah, so if I would say, next to only the staff costs, if we also allocate the supplier audits, the expediting, and other stuff, and I would say it's I think the conclusion is quite often comparable. So that if you do a rough volume-based allocation of costs, the bigger volume products or components obviously absorb more of the costs. And if you start refining your analysis, as I see it's in the chat here, if you start allocating based on drivers, you better reveal the cost of complexity, and then more specialized stuff or more slow-moving stuff, or stuff coming from more niche suppliers will gradually absorb more of the costs. But again, a better insight on the true cost and the true cost to serve, will help us to come to better pricing decisions and a better profitability analysis. And it will lead to different decisions, like the display example I gave. And by making different decisions, we will be positively affecting all of those financial parameters.
And another thing, what is quite remarkable in my opinion, if you look at the lower right side, you see the standard bolt and the specialty bolt, the expedite costs. Because we talked about a lot of disturbances, and then you have to go from sea to air. If you have this kind of cost allocation more better founded, you have a better way of making trade-offs. If you have not done so, you don't have the right basis to make trade-offs on expediting.
I agree, and in general, so there's also a lot of pressure on, take for instance, buying based on lowest cost. If you buy on lowest cost, you end up in the east, but then you have all kinds of disruptions, which makes that you need to start expediting and so on. But if you cannot reveal where the impact of the expediting is, and you allocate it equally over locally sourced product and product which is sourced far away. So if we don't create visibility or transparency, some of those discussions can never be properly had in companies.
No. So, we talk about costs, and we talk about data. So where is all this data stored in general? What kind of systems?
If you look at ERP systems, so the core ERP, again, those are more accounting systems, but the core of ERP systems is typically not helping with proper allocation management. ERP vendors may have specialized modules, like in SAP. You have the COPA module. It's an ERP module, which means it will help you to do cost allocations, but from a user friendliness and a scenario capability perspective, it will have limitations. And so in practice, I also see that a lot of costing and activity-based costing or refining costing is done outside of the ERP and is done in Excel files. And I think that a lot of those costing exercises are currently being done in Excel. If you look at FP&A tools, those are those are tool boxes, and those toolboxes, for instance, doing scenario analysis and what if our raw material cost would increase with 5 or 10%, or the cost of a specific raw material would increase with 5 or 10%. how would that impact cost prices and how would that impact margins of different product groups or in different regions. Yeah? I do see companies using these FP&A tools to do those type of analysis and those type of scenario capabilities. And so if you want to move away from Excel, those are probably logical tools to take a look at.
So before we get to the next slide about, the whole range from costing to planning, a few years ago, I got a message from one of the bigger strategy consultancy firms, and the one was creating a tool for measuring the cost of complexity. And it was a quite complex environment. And of course, and you have the cost of complexity on SKU level, and it's fine. And but then again, it didn't solve the origin, the cause of the complexity. So basically, it was a complex system, adding more complexity in your ERP FP&A environment of toolboxes. So it was and maybe that's a bit of a strategy consulting firm creating a complex system and talk about the cost of complexity. And by showing that, you would expect that someone would act upon it. You get the hammer or get the slice it through the cost some way. So I think, do you recognize that there is also an environment, especially in the business strategy environment, to create overviews of the cost of complexity?
I'd say I don't have the experience with strategy consultants as such. What it does trigger with me is that companies bury themselves under complexity, and I would say especially in engineering companies. So when it's in technology and it's business to business, like for instance R&D driven or product driven. So companies sometimes really drown in complexity, and on the one hand, I can understand that complexity can get overwhelming, but if you take 2 steps, so let's put it like that. Instead of then building a very complex model, my feeling is go in steps, and don't try to go in one go. But if you refine your cost model, again, Pareto wise, with 20% of the complexity, you will get already 80% of the insights.
Yep.
And you can start making big moves and you can start steering from there. And to be able to steer on a next level of detail, you might need to further refine the cost model. But I've really seen activity-based costing projects taking 18 months or 2 years, and then you come up with a costing model that is so complex that nobody really understands why the outcome is what it is. And it's always the same. If you create a black box, people will not trust it, so it will not be very effective. So complexity can be overwhelming, but taking an iterative Pareto-driven approach, I think it's also in my DNA. It's,
Yeah, another remark in the chat, that's quite interesting to maybe to discuss. In process of time to market projects, of introducing new projects into the market, supply chain designer role would be a key figure to calculate the total cost. So when you go to market and you have a design phase, etc., what is your take in all this? Because that's also complex. Should they be involved in how, if you're introducing a new product and they have a go-to-market?
Yeah, so I think NPIs and introducing new products is a chapter in itself. And so what I noticed there is that NPIs are, so when people introduce a new product, they try to optimize the supply chain for cost. So we try to decide whether to launch something, yes or no, based on the margin potential. But what we always forget is if the forecast of an NPI is 100, we know that we're not going to sell 100. It could be it could be anywhere between 20 and 250. So next to refining the costing for NPIs, I mean, supply chain needs to be involved, but supply chain needs to be involved also from the perspective of how do we make it more scalable. And so when we launch something new, instead of trying to make a PhD on the business case and so on, what we should do is scale fast or fail fast. So supply chain should be involved to say, okay, how can we find out as quickly as possible whether it's going to be 20 or whether it's going to be 250? And when it's 20, maybe it's never going to bring us any money anyway. So then we better pull the plug. And when we know whether it's going towards 200 or 250, I think that's when we really need to start fine-tuning and designing the supply chain and start optimizing the cost. But I mean, so only in a second step, not in the first step. That's what that whole NPI question triggers with me, and the involvement of supply chain and the costing exercises that we do there.
Yeah. So you mentioned at the start, when you would be able to write the next book, you would go down on talking about connected planning. Maybe you can talk through this slide, from costing to connected planning.
Yeah, so I think what we tried to explain so far is like, if we don't have a good insight in the true cost to serve, it's hard to get to good pricing. Yeah, it's also hard to get to good profitability analysis. Yeah. And recently, when talking to finance people and to controllers, so another thing that keeps striking me is that controllers and finance are fond about variance analysis. And I'm literally in meetings where a CFO is there or a controller is there, and then I hear, okay. Our margins were a bit lower last month, or our cost was a bit higher last month because we did more with a third-party manufacturer. And then I'm at the table and I say, hey, but if you would have a decent supply chain plan, I could have told you 2 months up front that we were going to do more with an external manufacturer. In another meeting, the CFO was there, and she said, yeah, our margins have been under pressure this summer, and we have an issue with one of our manufacturing lines, and it's exactly on that line that we are making higher margin product. And again, I think, dear CFO, from a supply chain perspective, we knew that we had an issue at that line, so we could have predicted that this was going to have a margin impact and an EBIT impact. So the obvious connection to make is instead of doing a variance analysis or a profitability analysis looking backward, that we include that information in a forward-looking instrument, and that forward-looking, we say, okay, we have a capacity issue on that line. Yeah, we can do more with an outsourced manufacturing partner. Yeah, that will be good for the sales and for the top line. Yeah, but we will see that it will negatively impact the cost, and that from an EBITDA perspective, we will not get the full 100%, because if it's forward-looking, we can potentially still influence it. If it's only backward-looking, obviously what is in the past we can no longer change. And so increasingly, when I talk about that to CFOs, to controllers, I see a lot of enthusiasm, but I see still a lot of hesitation within the supply chain community, like, hey, but is this what we really want? And this is not our responsibility, and we are entering the finance domain, and how will finance react to that? But if I take 2 steps back, it's obviously that all of this should not just be looking backward, but we will start really impacting value if we can do all of this looking forward.
Yeah, and when I look at this, what triggers me is S&OP was designed to do financial budget closing. So at the end of the month, you have the discussion, okay, going forward, we have matched supply and demand. Are we going to make our budget this year or even next year? But I think, I don't hear that phrase budget gap closing analysis too often. They're already happy to match supply and demand. And then you go forward, and then looking back last quarter, we have a margin presence, whatever. Basically, you were saying, we don't make our budget this year. And then in the last quarter, we have to come up some magic to make it happen anyway. So basically, that's one thing. This the financial budget closing gap analysis during your S&OP or IBP cycle is not that mentioned often, I think.
No, and so when we do supply chain planning, I increasingly say it to companies, and I always ask explicitly for a meeting with the CFO, and I say, okay, when you do the investment in a planning system, there's no reason why out of the volume plan should not have a rolling gross sales, a rolling net sales, a rolling gross margin forecast. And finance is concerned about cash flow, I would say rightfully. If you look at cash flow, working capital is important. And within working capital, inventory is the hardest part to predict. But again, once you do the investment in supply chain planning, there's no reason you should not get an inventory forecast and a working capital forecast out of it, and not in pieces or in units, but in euros.
And hopefully not only in euros, but also in dollars, because the conversion ratio is hitting you hard.
And then I would say, so when I explained, if finance is increasingly enthusiastic, and you should not try to do a budgeting process, for instance, in an APS tool.
No.
But if finance already has a rolling forecast on those key elements, adding some extra costs like the SG&A and doing some scenario analysis is not that difficult anymore. And you get a much tighter connection of the two plans, and you get a forward-looking plan rather than a backward-looking analysis.
Yes, and another thing, what's remarkable to me from this slide, you see the ABC XYZ analysis. That's on product level. So you have the fast movers versus the slow movers. Mm-hmm. But I don't, and you have this kind of overviews in APS systems and the like. But what I'm missing fundamentally in all the systems I've seen, and I've seen a lot of software, supply chain software, there's no software that's coming up every month with a matrix where you have ABC on customer or channel profitability, ABC, and simultaneously ABC on product level. So basically, the CC articles are low margin to low margin profitability customer or channels you can get rid of right away. And of course, to get this kind of ABC metrics on customer and product profitability, you need cost allocation on a proper way. And maybe that's the reason why I haven't seen it. I know some tools that are doing that, especially for SAP environment. But I don't see this kind of tools for optimizing your portfolio.
Yeah, I agree. That's and again, that's so. Because the tools are not there, the complexity is often hidden. And so what salespeople in general, and I'm generalizing, will do is they want to score business. And before you know, for a low profitability customer, you end up with customer specific products with customer specific raw materials and recipes.
Yep.
And that's obviously not what you want. So having a better insight on that customer product portfolio, and then creating segmentations and say, okay, where do we allow customer specific raw materials or recipes for which type of customers, and what's the type of margins we want to drive from it. So there's a lot of companies who don't have that type of discussion. And starting that type of discussion based on that type of information, I think can make a huge difference in the way you handle and deal with the complexity in the supply chain.
Yeah, and basically, I would say you have to have a part in your S&OP process. Step number one: portfolio optimization every month, not every year, every month. Mm-hmm. So that's my point. All right, 2 slides to go. So when you take a look at the P&L and beyond, how does it look?
Yeah, so on the one hand, on this slide, what you see on the right is almost like a recap. So if I compile a bit the examples I've given before, but on this, so the scheme on the left is referring to my supply chain triangle. Service is a driver for sales. Sales minus cost gives a margin. So on the service side, if sales starts improvising, like before, you have a customer with customer-specific products and customer-specific raw materials and recipes, with store-level picking and delivery, And so if you try to understand where the cost impact is, it's really across the P&L, I would say. So if it's customer-specific raw material, that could impact the direct material cost. But if it's customer-specific product, I may have customer-specific batches. So it might impact my changeovers and my manufacturing overhead. So the store level picking and delivery, as we discussed, could end up in the SG&A. So I cannot only look at the variable cost because the changeovers are in the manufacturing overhead or in the standard cost. So I for sure will need to look at the gross margin, but even looking at gross margin might not be good enough because my warehousing and logistics might be in my SG&A. So I really need to look at that total cost of ownership or that TCO, which cuts across the P&L to come to a good pricing model, and then to come to a good profitability analysis and compare customers. But it doesn't stop at the margins. If I switch back to the scheme on the left, I can have two customers with a relatively low margin. If for that one customer it's make to order, and the payment is immediate, meaning I have zero working capital, it's maybe still okay. But if for that second customer, I have 30 days of inventory and I have 120 days of payment terms, meaning that I have 150 days of working capital locked up, and then it no longer makes sense. So I can also not only judge by the margin, I also need to look at what's the capital employed. For instance, what is the inventories and the working capital I need to put on the ground to finance or to fund that business. So I would say always when we look at value, here we focus on cost and on margins, but we need to zoom out and we need to make sure that we have the different corners of the supply chain triangle, which is key in all of my books.
Yes, and finally, and then we get to the triangle. Next to this, you have the social foundation and you have the environmental ceiling, and also you have sustainability as another angle to your triangle. But still, again, you have to take into account what you want, what you don't want for sustainability reasons.
Yeah, and so to come back to the firefighting and the improvising we do as customers, that so when I'm expediting stuff and I'm using air freight, it's not only having an impact on my logistic cost, it also has an impact on my CO2, so on my environmental ceiling. Or when I decide to rush something through production, it could be that I'm not only having an impact on the waste in my supply chain from a cost perspective, but I'm also having, again, a waste impact from an environmental perspective. And if I need to rush stuff through production and I need to do overtime in a holiday period, I'm also impacting my social foundation. So if we want to be truly sustainable companies, we need to understand the impact of our decisions, not only on costs and margins, but also on how it's driving return, and not only financial return, but also how it's impacting our sustainability metrics and our sustainability objectives. And I don't know a lot of companies who have that full impact analysis today, but okay, if I can be forward thinking, when we make decisions in an S&OP, again, it's not only about what is the financial impact, but it's also about what's the impact on our social foundation and environmental ceiling. Otherwise, we will never be truly sustainable companies.
Another thing, so final slide, I was triggered. Of course, I know your books, I've read them, etc. And you have this triangle, cost, service, and cash, or working capital. So I created this slide. Basically, I'm fed up with all this Excel-based on steroids S&OP kind of software, because executives don't like Excels. They don't like this. They want to have other images. They want to have other user interfaces. So basically, I came up with this. This is, based on a professor of mine 30 years ago, working capital analysis, cash flow analysis. These are the bubbles. So basically, all your working capital is in there, and you can make choices. So if you have customer intimacy, it will cost more. If you have operational excellence, you squeeze in all the balls, and you get more working capital out of it. So I created this. So you have supply chain metrics, cost to serve, forecast value add, and return on capital employed, ROCE. So that's in the middle. So all this managing your supply chain, you have your supply chain department and your systems, and it will cost money. So basically, this is what I think you should discuss with your financial colleagues. So working capital, I have discussions with executive lately. Yeah, accounts receivable and accounts payable is all managed and it's doing fine. So it's somewhere in my inventory. And basically, is it raw materials, work in progress, is it finished goods or spare parts? You have to dissect it. And basically, depending on your industry, if you are in automotive, finished goods inventory, it will be called off within the same day or next day. So you cannot squeeze it over there. So it's where to squeeze. And on the right-hand side, supply chain costs, different kind of costs, like Bram mentioned, would have to be taken into account. On service level, OTIF, I hate OTIF. It's not one KPI, but two. It's on time, that's speed, in full, completeness. So what would you rather prefer? 80 this week out of 100 or 100 next week? So these are the conversations you should be having with sales. So, Bram, this is my interpretation of your book and how to translate it into a user interface that does make sense depending on your business strategy. What is your take if you look at this?
Yeah, I like it. So the example where visualizing the strategy impact and saying, okay, operational excellence would mean that we are a bit more strict on the service side, and that will allow us to reduce the cost and be very efficient from a working capital perspective. And as we start adding complexity on the service side, because strategically we want to differentiate from a lowest price player, and that could be more complex products, or that could be a broader product portfolio, but we know that will increase the cost side, and that will increase the working capital side. So it resonates well with me. And so lately I would say I've been discussing more with finance people and CFOs, and it's almost my colleagues who told me like, Bram, but if you talk to finance, you cannot call it the supply chain triangle. Let's call it something different. And I need to tell them, like, finance people really don't care. Finance likes the model as much as a supply chain likes it, because it also helps them to understand how these things connect. And finance truly sees the value of using these type of models to, in the end, drive better financial results. So I always hoped that it was a potential way to engage in a different type of discussion with finance. And each time I show this to finance, they love it. And I think finance is much closer to supply chain than maybe I would have thought of it in the past.
And a good point with this, I showed it to a supply chain director who's doing a lot in Power BI, and he said to me, I've created this in Power BI. You have bubble charts. So nowadays you can create this kind of actual user interface with these bubbles in bubble charts within Power BI. So there is no hurdle anymore to get this kind of user interface.
Yeah, I would love to see it.
Yeah. So we get there. So we're almost out of time. So there's maybe room for one question. So maybe to you, people who have seen it, what should they do tomorrow, Bram?
Well, I think what should they do tomorrow is don't assume standard costs for the truth. Be aware that when you analyze profitabilities, standard cost anyway is not enough. To take a pragmatic approach, and yes, time-based, activity-based costing, I would say it's like the high-level mechanism, but try to take an iterative approach by gradually refining the cost, gradually getting a better understanding of which products and customers are bringing more or less value. And we talked a lot about the costs and the margins here, but don't forget the working capital that you put on the ground, because in the end it's about how do we drive return and how do we drive bang for the buck.
My suggestion would be, for all the people listening, download the slides and go to your financial colleagues and discuss it with them first, and then go to your commercial colleagues and then discuss it with them. All right, we're out of time, but thank you for joining. We will sit down in the virtual lounge if you have more questions to Bram or me. With that, I want to wrap up. So on the left, you see something that's a company IT portfolio to map out what kind of system do you have and do you need, and where do you get the data from to create this kind of bubble charts for financial reasons. On the right-hand side, you see a white paper on integrated value planning, SNOP 2.0 by Bram. So, more to read and more to understand over there. With the audience being live or being in the recording, thank you for listening and joining with the chat. A lot of interesting comments. And finally, Bram, thank you for joining for a nice lecture, I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, my big pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for now, and I would say bye-bye for next week. We have another webinar coming up, similar in line, but more practical, but maybe we will see you there. If not, I hope to see you in another webinar, or I will see you in the lounge right after this. Thank you, and bye-bye.